I really have to confide in someone about this workplace predicament, as it's truly unsettling my equilibrium. To be frank, I feel like I'm completely unraveling because of it. My name is Chelsea. I'm 24 years old, and this peculiar circumstance has been ongoing for nearly a full year, escalating in its intensity with each passing day. Approximately 12 months back, our company brought on a new employee named Dan. Right from his very first day, there was an unmistakable oddity about his demeanor. I mean, profoundly strange. He's 27. His resume suggested a perfectly typical individual, yet his interactions with female colleagues are undeniably peculiar. And truthfully, this behavior is beginning to genuinely irritate me. During his initial weeks, we collectively endeavored to make him feel welcome, which is standard procedure for any new hire, isn't it? Myself, along with the other female staff, Megan, whose desk is situated 2 positions away from mine, and Sarah, who occupies the workspace directly behind my own. We consciously worked to bring him into discussions, extend invitations for lunch, inquire about his weekend activities, essentially all the customary office pleasantries. However, Dan consistently provided extremely concise responses, then either simply departed or reverted his attention to his computer, as though we were entirely invisible. Initially, we considered the possibility that he was merely timid or anxious about his new role, but it quickly became unequivocally apparent that such was not the explanation. What truly began to bother me was his habit of abruptly terminating discussions whenever any of us women attempted to engage him on subjects unrelated to our professional duties. For instance, I might inquire if he had enjoyable plans for the weekend, and he would simply respond with, "Not really," before instantly resuming typing or poring over documents. Yet moments later, I'd witness him conversing animatedly with the male colleagues about athletics or cinema, or similar topics for durations of approximately 20 minutes at a stretch. The contrast was exceedingly apparent, and frankly, quite discourteous. My ultimate breaking point occurred one particular day when I extended an invitation for him to accompany our lunch contingent. We habitually frequent a small eatery located just down the thoroughfare, an outing that is typically rather enjoyable. His sole reply was, "Thanks, but I have other commitments," uttered without him even glancing up from his workspace. However, later that very afternoon, I observed him sharing laughter and banter with Jake and Marcus from accounting, as if they were lifelong companions. He presented as an entirely transformed individual. Confiding in you, the situation rapidly began to feel rather personally directed. I mean, typically I navigate social interactions quite adeptly, and I've genuinely never encountered someone who would simply disregard me so thoroughly. Megan also took note of this pattern. Sarah too grew exasperated, having attempted on numerous occasions to initiate dialogue with him, only to receive terse single-word replies before he would simply depart. Consequently, we found ourselves discussing it with increasing frequency, given its sheer oddity. Observing his conduct around his male colleagues amplified the strangeness considerably. He would readily integrate himself into their casual discussions, genuinely chuckle at their jests, and even engage in their minor office fantasy football league they had established. Yet when it came to us, there was utter silence, absolutely no communication beyond a strained good morning or have a good evening. Even these brief greetings felt contrived and insincere. For a time, I endeavored to extend him the benefit of doubt, entertaining the idea that perhaps he simply felt uneasy in the presence of women, or perhaps he grappled with some form of social anxiety. However, the more I scrutinized his interactions with all others, the clearer it became that this behavior was a conscious and intentional decision on his part. He was explicitly opting against cordiality with the female staff members, while simultaneously exhibiting entirely normal and gregarious conduct with every single male colleague. Sarah articulated aloud what had been unspoken thoughts among us all, that his deportment was fostering a strange, unsettling environment, leaving the women feeling marginalized and unwelcome. It begged the question, why should we be compelled to tread so carefully around this individual when he so plainly demonstrated an ability for typical human engagement? The whole situation simply defied logic, and candidly, it was beginning to truly exasperate me, in a manner that I found rather astonishing. Our collective frustration mounted proportionally with each successive discussion about the matter. Here we stood, striving to be hospitable and all-encompassing, striving to forge a constructive professional atmosphere for all. Yet this individual was simply rebuffing our efforts while bestowing upon the men the privilege of his typical gregarious demeanor. It felt profoundly unjust and improper. And quite frankly, it was starting to negatively influence my enthusiasm for attending work each day. A resolution was clearly necessary, and I was growing weary of feigning acceptance of his conduct when it was patently unacceptable. Subsequent to that, I commenced observing Dan's behavioral patterns with far greater scrutiny, and truthfully, what I uncovered only exacerbated the entire predicament. To be clear, I'm not typically inclined to meticulously dissect another person's every action, but his comportment was so overtly troublesome that I felt compelled to ascertain the true nature of the situation. And believe me, once I began to examine things more closely, the corroboration was utterly pervasive. Without fail, each morning Dan would enter, offer a generic greeting to the room at large, and then promptly initiate conversations with whichever male colleagues happened to be nearby. He would inquire about Jake's weekend, exchange jests with Marcus regarding a television program they both enjoyed, and even engage our supervisor in casual conversation about miscellaneous topics for periods of 10 or 15 minutes. However, should any of us women attempt to participate in these discussions or indeed commence our own with him, he would abruptly adopt an entirely formal and professional demeanor. It was akin to witnessing someone instantaneously activate a different mode. I began meticulously documenting particular occurrences simply because the increasing obviousness of his actions defied belief. For instance, on one occasion, Megan remarked that she was experiencing difficulties with her automobile and felt quite stressed about arranging its repair. Dan was literally positioned in close proximity, yet he neither volunteered assistance nor even acknowledged her statement. Yet later that same day, when Marcus casually brought up that his vehicle was emitting unusual sounds, Dan devoted approximately 20 minutes to offering him guidance on automotive technicians and even proposed inspecting it himself. 20 minutes of his time dedicated to a man he had acquainted himself with for under a year, juxtaposed with his complete disregard for a woman requesting precisely the same category of assistance. The daily lunchtime arrangements became even more absurd. We would frequently observe him dining in solitude, or occasionally joining the male contingent when they ventured out, yet he consistently declined every single invitation extended by us women. Sarah, for her part, likely attempted to invite him to join our assembly on 6 separate occasions. Each and every instance he produced some rationale for declining, only to subsequently go for coffee with the men, or accompany them for post-work beverages as if it were entirely inconsequential. It became exceedingly clear that he was deliberately shunning our company. And truthfully, this behavior was beginning to feel profoundly personal and quite wounding. What truly resonated with me was the apparent dichotomy in his entire persona, contingent upon the individual with whom he was conversing. In the company of the men, he was humorous, at ease, and entirely conventional. He would crack jokes, recount anecdotes from his personal life, and even voice grievances about topics such as traffic congestion or his living quarters, among other things. Conversely, with us, his vocabulary was restricted to yes ma'am and no ma'am, coupled with intensely formal, distant replies that rendered every single interaction feel strained and discomforting. Megan highlighted the fact that he similarly never posed any personal inquiries to any of us. For instance, he would inquire about the men's pastimes, their familial situations, and their prospective weekend activities, yet he never once evinced any genuine interest in our lives beyond the confines of the office. It was as if he perceived us as mere automatons, existing solely within operational hours, while his male counterparts were considered authentic individuals deserving of acquaintance. The definitive moment arrived during a particular team assembly where each participant was encouraged to disclose an intriguing personal detail. Every male attendee received attentive, inquisitive reactions from Dan. He posed subsequent queries, drew parallels to his own experiences, and even openly laughed at their narratives. However, when my turn came to describe my weekend excursion involving hiking, he merely offered a courteous nod and remained utterly silent. An identical scenario unfolded for Sarah when she spoke of her passion for photography, and for Megan when she referenced her volunteer endeavors. Nothing but civil acknowledgements and quietude. Following that gathering, the 3 of us sought out coffee and engaged in a profound discussion regarding the unfolding situation. We universally concurred that his conduct transcended mere strangeness. In reality, It was fabricating a rather inimical atmosphere wherein we felt alienated and undesired within our very own professional setting. Sarah stated she had never encountered anything comparable, and Megan articulated that she was beginning to anticipate her arrival at work with apprehension due to the intense awkwardness and discomfort she experienced in his vicinity. I recognized that my primary source of vexation stemmed from the sheer inequity of the entire circumstance. Here we were, attempting to cultivate geniality and inclusivity, striving to forge a constructive professional atmosphere for all. Yet this individual was simply rebuffing our efforts while bestowing upon the men the privilege of his typical gregarious demeanor. It felt, in all sincerity, discriminatory, and I was growing weary of feigning that it was not impacting every single one of us. Action needed to be taken regarding Dan's deportment, and it was becoming unequivocally apparent that a strategy of patience and empathy would yield no alteration. The dynamic concerning Dan elevated significantly when I resolved to truly comprehend the underlying mechanisms, as his actions had become far too anomalous to continue disregarding. To clarify, I am not typically one to fixate on colleagues, but this particular issue was impinging upon my complete professional experience, and I felt entirely justified in ascertaining the nature of his idiosyncrasies. Consequently, I commenced observing his every action with increased vigilance, and my findings were, quite frankly, startling. My initial step involved examining his social networking profiles, surmising that such an investigation might offer some clarity regarding his character, and whether his aloofness was a pervasive trait or solely directed towards women. It transpired that his Facebook and Instagram accounts depicted an entirely distinct individual, a person who appeared highly sociable and gregarious within diverse groups of acquaintances, frequently sharing images from celebratory events and informal gatherings that included both men and women. Therefore, it was evident that he possessed the capacity for conventional social engagement with women outside the professional domain, which rendered his office conduct even more perplexing and, candidly, more offensive. I initiated a practice of coordinating my breaks and meal intervals with his own, solely to meticulously monitor his interactions with various individuals throughout the workday. What I ascertained was an extraordinarily unwavering pattern wherein he exhibited warmth and geniality toward his male associates, yet maintained a distant and formal demeanor with every female colleague. For instance, I observed him dedicate 45 minutes to assisting Jake in resolving a computer malfunction, all the while jesting and displaying complete composure throughout the entire period. Yet when Sarah put forth a straightforward inquiry regarding a joint undertaking, he responded with a mere 2-sentence utterance before turning away. The more intently I observed, the greater the volume of proof I amassed, solidifying my conviction that this was undeniably prejudicial conduct. I commenced documenting everything, as the pattern was unequivocally distinct and profoundly troubling. Dan would indeed engage in communal discussions, but he invariably channeled all his remarks and queries exclusively toward the male staff present. He would spontaneously offer assistance to his male colleagues with their projects or challenges, yet he never extended a hand to any of the female staff members, even when we were visibly encountering difficulties. He chuckled readily at quips originating from the male contingent, but met comparable comedic efforts from women with a courteous yet chilling quietude. Megan and Sarah were wholly backing me when I shared my emerging discoveries, and they too began monitoring more diligently. We came to realize that Dan had been invited to join the men's exclusive messaging group where they engaged in discussions about athletics and arranged social gatherings post-work hours, but not a single one of us female employees had ever been included in anything of the sort. He was actively constructing an insular social network, deliberately excluding every female team member, all while presenting such actions as entirely typical and permissible. The foremost exasperating aspect was witnessing others seemingly oblivious or indifferent to the unfolding situation. The male co-workers were entirely content with Dan because he accorded them favorable treatment, so they perceived no issue with his conduct. Even our supervisor failed to discern the reality that Dan was establishing a bifurcated arrangement where male associates received his camaraderie and social engagement, whereas women were afforded merely rudimentary professional politeness. Sarah suggested that perhaps we should systematically record particular occurrences with greater formality, as what we were experiencing felt as though it could actually be in contravention of corporate guidelines. Consequently, We started maintaining a meticulous log of exact dates and specific times when Dan's unequal handling was undeniably glaring. For instance, the time he proposed to take over Jake's assigned duty when Jake had an urgent domestic matter. But when Megan faced a comparable predicament exactly 2 weeks subsequent, Dan remained utterly silent and proffered no aid whatsoever. Or, when he delivered freshly baked biscuits to distribute among the male staff, yet withheld them from the women in the office. I also started discreetly posing inquiries to the male colleagues to ascertain Dan's demeanor during their social interactions outside of professional hours. It transpired that he was entirely conventional, humorous, captivating, open to discussing intimate details, and eager to recount life narratives. Marcus recounted that Dan had divulged information concerning his kin, leisure pursuits, and even a few romantic anecdotes. Conversely, not one of the female employees possessed any insight into his private existence, as he adamantly declined to impart even the most rudimentary facts with us. The proof was accumulating to an irrefutable degree that Dan was intentionally engaging in disparate treatment of the women in our office compared to the men, and it was fostering an unwelcoming professional atmosphere where we felt diminished in worth. I mean, we were all performing identical roles and meriting identical fundamental courtesy and social engagement. But Dan had seemingly decided that solely the male workforce merited being treated as genuine individuals. By this juncture, I was convinced that Dan's conduct amounted to professional prejudice, and I was weary of simply enduring it and optimistically awaiting its transformation. The trio of us resolved to initiate proceedings and lodge a formal grievance because what was happening was neither equitable nor something we ought to suffer merely to retain our employment. The day I decided to file the complaint with Human Resources was honestly among the most affirming instances I'd had in months, as I finally felt as though I was undertaking tangible measures concerning Dan's unacceptable behavior rather than passively enduring it perpetually. I had attained my ultimate threshold of endurance the week before, when we had this collective midday meal proposal that was so flagrantly biased I could no longer disregard it. What occurred was that Jake and Marcus were orchestrating this luncheon excursion to commemorate the completion of a significant undertaking, and they extended invitations to the entirety of our department. When they asked Dan if he wished to participate, he promptly assented and began discussing his desire to sample that particular eatery for several months. But then, when the dialogue shifted to practical arrangements and Sarah noted her necessity to reschedule certain appointments to facilitate her attendance, Dan abruptly altered his stance, declaring his inability to attend after all due to prior engagements. It was patently clear he wished to avoid participation if female colleagues were to be present, and honestly, it was demeaning for every one of us. Within that identical week, I observed Dan agree to an invitation for post-work beverages with the men, jesting about his need to decompress following a taxing work day. But when Megan offhandedly suggested that a cohort of us intended to explore a newly opened happy hour venue, and he might consider joining, he gave her a chilly, "Thank you, but I am occupied" retort, delivered without so much as glancing away from me, his monitor. The dual standard was so flagrant and utterly offensive that I knew I could no longer maintain the pretense that this conduct was typical or permissible. So I arranged an appointment with Human Resources and requested Megan and Sarah accompany me, desiring their participation in recounting their own experiences. I devoted the preceding evening to collating all the records I had been maintaining, precise dates and occurrences where Dan's disparate conduct was most apparent, illustrations of how his actions were detrimentally impacting our professional setting, and proof of his capacity for typical social engagement which he deliberately withheld from the women within our office. The Human Resources consultation proceeded precisely as I had anticipated. The HR representative, Lisa, regarded our grievance with utmost gravity and posed exhaustive inquiries concerning Dan's behavioral trends. She seemed especially troubled when we elucidated how Dan's preferential social interaction was fostering an environment in which the women experienced feelings of marginalization and diminished worth in contrast to their male counterparts. When I presented her with my compilation of particular events, she affirmed that it was evident we had encountered something requiring formal inquiry. Lisa clarified that our descriptions could potentially amount to gender-based discrimination, and that establishing varied standards of conduct for male and female staff members was an issue the corporation addressed with great earnestness. She gave us her word that they would undertake a comprehensive investigation and interview additional personnel to gain a holistic understanding of what was transpiring. I experienced immense affirmation upon hearing her declare our experiences to be valid professional concerns, rather than merely our being unduly susceptible, as I had begun to fear we might be. The most gratifying aspect was when Lisa informed us she would be addressing Dan personally regarding his conduct, unequivocally stating that all staff members must be afforded identical politeness and deference irrespective of their gender. She said that should the inquiry substantiate our grievances, punitive measures would be applied to Dan, alongside mandates for him to amend his future conduct. At long last, a figure of authority was treating this predicament with earnestness and acknowledging that our protracted ordeal was wholly untenable. After the meeting, I felt a profound sensation of alleviation and capability. For months, I'd been feeling exasperated and powerless about Dan's treatment of us, but now I'd initiated tangible measures to address the problem. Megan and Sarah were both thankful I had commenced the formal complaint procedure, and we all concurred that we had acted appropriately by voicing our concerns rather than persistently enduring inquietude. I'll admit, a segment of me anticipated witnessing Dan's reaction once Human Resources challenged him regarding his behavior. I presumed he would either be compelled to issue an apology and commence treating us with fundamental human respect, or he would adopt a defensive posture and expose his authentic disposition, which would unequivocally fortify our allegations. Either way, I was certain the inquiry would substantiate our accusations and compel Dan to alter his prejudiced conduct towards the women in our office. The entire situation began to unravel when Human Resources summoned me back for what I had presumed would be a subsequent consultation to inform me of the repercussions Dan was encountering for his biased actions. Instead, I entered that meeting chamber only to be confronted with revelations that utterly astounded me and frankly caused me to re-evaluate every perception I held regarding the circumstances. Lisa commenced the discussion by elucidating that their inquiry was complete and they had conversed with Dan concerning our grievances. But rather than detailing any punitive measures or mandatory behavioral modifications, she began to articulate his viewpoint on the matter and how he had furnished background information regarding his professional interactions. I was already experiencing an ominous presentiment about where this was heading, but absolutely nothing could have equipped me for the ensuing disclosure. Evidently, Dan had elucidated to Human Resources that he rigorously upheld professional distance with female co-workers due to an occurrence at his preceding place of employment, where informal collegial relations with women in the workplace culminated in allegations of harassment against him. He told them that he had been unjustly implicated by a female associate who misunderstood their amiable interactions as romantic overtures, and that this ordeal had almost jeopardized his professional trajectory and standing. Consequently, he now adheres to what he termed a professional decorum exclusively directive concerning women at work, ostensibly to safeguard himself from analogous misinterpretations. I was utterly flabbergasted. Lisa was sitting there rationalizing this as if it somehow legitimized Dan's conduct, as though his prior ordeal bestowed upon him the prerogative to regard every woman in the professional sphere as a prospective menace undeserving of fundamental social engagement. I endeavored to articulate that irrespective of his motivations, his disparate treatment continued to foster an unwelcoming atmosphere for us. But Lisa appeared more preoccupied with his legal entitlement to preserve professional limitations than with the ramifications of his conduct upon the female staff in our division. The nadir of the discussion arrived when she disclosed that a contingent of our male colleagues had presented themselves to endorse Dan's stance during the formal inquiry. Apparently, Jake, Marcus, and even our direct manager had uniformly corroborated Dan's account of his prior professional engagements and had apprehended and backed his determination to uphold a purely professional demeanor with his female counterparts. A profound sense of perfidy washed over me in that moment. I had considered these individuals our comrades and fellow laborers, yet in the crucible of this confrontation, they aligned themselves with Dan, tacitly validating his seemingly prejudicial conduct as entirely justifiable. It was then that Lisa unleashed the genuine revelation. She stated that throughout their investigation, a number of personnel had conveyed apprehension regarding the manner in which Megan, Sarah, and I had been observing and conversing about Dan's deportment. It appeared that our surveillance of him, our deliberate coordination of breaks to scrutinize his engagements, and our incessant internal discussions concerning him had not gone unobserved. A segment of our fellow workers characterized our actions as obsessive and disquieting. Moreover, a handful had formally registered grievances, asserting that we were fomenting organizational turmoil and inducing discomfort in their personal exchanges with Dan. The assertions were beyond my immediate comprehension. Inexplicably, our status had inverted. From being the recipients of prejudiced treatment, we now found ourselves facing accusations of perpetrating harassment. Lisa elucidated that the systematic observation of a colleague's conduct, the meticulous record-keeping of their social dealings, and the cultivation of an adverse atmosphere via incessant dialogue and grievance filing could, by the strictures of corporate policy, indeed amount to workplace harassment. Our sentiments, she conceded, held validity, but our rejoinder to the circumstances, she stated, had transgressed certain boundaries, occasioning unease among other staff members. The deliberation concluded with Lisa informing me that no punitive measures would be enacted against Dan, as his comportment, though perhaps less than amiable, contravened no established corporate regulations and was, in essence, within the purview of his employee entitlements. Conversely, she articulated that Megan, Sarah and I would be required to participate in compulsory sensitivity education sessions focused on suitable professional conduct and the demarcation of occupational limits. Furthermore, she added that the circumstances would be subject to ongoing oversight to preclude any additional occurrences of harassment or antagonistic conduct. I departed the conference room utterly mortified and disoriented. How had a scenario which to my perception was undeniably one of explicit discrimination against us, transmuted into one where we, astonishingly, were deemed the transgressors? My conviction persisted that Dan's actions were both erroneous and inequitable, yet the corporation, it seemed, held a divergent view, identifying us as the root of the issue. This marked the pinnacle of vexation and nullification I had ever encountered in my professional life, leaving me without a coherent framework to assimilate the recent unfolding of events. The period following that human resources consultation proved to be, without exaggeration, the most mortifying and ruinous chapter of my entire professional journey. I remain in the midst of grappling with the profound reversal of fortune, unable to fully comprehend how efforts aimed at rectifying bona fide workplace bias could have culminated in such an egregious miscarriage. Subsequent events unfolded as if observing the protracted disintegration of my career trajectory, a cruel, decelerated implosion. The most bitter pill to swallow was the prevailing sentiment that my predicament was entirely merited. In the span of a single week subsequent to our mandatory sensitivity workshops, intelligence concerning the inquiry and its resolution had, through an unknown conduit, permeated the entirety of the corporate environment. The precise origin of this informational seepage eluded my discovery. Nevertheless, it became instantaneously public knowledge that Megan, Sarah and I had lodged formal grievances alleging harassment against Dan, and that the HR department had determined we were the parties guilty of unbefitting conduct. The gazes directed my way by fellow employees conveyed a composite of discomfort, disapproval, and, at times, overt animosity. It was as though I had been transmuted into an insidious influence, a catalyst for discord, rendering the professional existence of all others unduly arduous. The intricate social fabric within our division underwent a comprehensive metamorphosis, decidedly to our detriment. Individuals who had previously extended invitations for midday meals and engaged in informal exchanges now maintained a perceptible aloofness, as if harboring apprehension that their own interactions might be meticulously chronicled, serving as fodder for future complaints. More galling still, I observed a number of colleagues expending extraordinary effort to exhibit pronounced affability and inclusivity towards Dan, a gesture that almost seemed designed to underscore the perceived irrationality of our accusations. To witness him being treated as a martyr requiring safeguarding from our alleged transgressions ignited within me an absolute fury. My affiliation with Megan and Sarah concurrently began to unravel, a development profoundly disheartening, given my conviction that we stood in solidarity amidst these circumstances. Sarah initiated the fissure, asserting that I had coerced her into lodging the grievance and that, fundamentally, she had never considered Dan's conduct genuinely problematic. Her participation, she contended, was merely acquiescence to avoid discord with me. Currently, however, she lamented her involvement and attributed the professional repercussions she endured entirely to my influence. Megan demonstrated greater resilience, yet ultimately, she began articulating observations suggesting our potential misinterpretation of the predicament, positing that perhaps we ought to have simply accommodated Dan's professional demarcations, instead of escalating the entire affair. The coup de grace was delivered when I ascertained that Dan had been presented with an offer of advancement to an alternate division with immediate effectuation. Human resources characterized this as a horizontal transition, ostensibly advantageous for his professional progression. Yet it was patently clear that this constituted a recompense for his composed management of our grievances simultaneously, serving to extract him from our perceived noxious influence. Concurrently, a formal censure was affixed to my personnel record, destined to negatively impact my performance evaluations and foreclose future prospects for promotion. Dan received career advancement and official vindication, whilst I was stigmatized as an agitator, seemingly incapable of navigating typical professional engagements. The irony deepened when I began to endure precisely the brand of social exclusion I had previously imputed to Dan. Colleagues would abruptly cease conversations upon my approach. Invitations for midday sustenance would inexplicably bypass me, and a pervasive aura of polite but reserved interaction characterized any necessary exchange with me. The bitter irony was not lost upon me. I was now the solitary diner at lunchtime, experiencing the profound sensation of being ostracized from the established social milieu of the office. However, unlike Dan's predicament, my own isolation stemmed directly from my personal conduct and flawed discernment. My occupational efficacy began to wane, a direct consequence of the overwhelming distraction and profound demoralization induced by the entire debacle. I found myself dedicating half of my workday to ruminating on the perceived injustice of my treatment and strategizing ways to rehabilitate my professional standing, rather than concentrating on my actual vocational duties. My immediate superior commenced voicing observations regarding my disposition and output, thereby compounding my stress and crystallizing the realization that my tenure with the corporation might not extend indefinitely. The most disquieting facet of this entire ordeal is my continued inability to fully apprehend how I was cast as the antagonist in circumstances where I was, in earnest, convinced I was confronting systemic workplace prejudice. Dan persists in upholding his professional demarcations with his female associates, a practice now seemingly universally perceived as entirely judicious and fitting. Meanwhile, I am saddled with the notoriety of being a purveyor of superfluous turmoil, purportedly incapable of managing professional interrelations with the equanimity of a seasoned individual. I have, in essence, been transformed into a cautionary narrative, illustrating the repercussions of misconstruing organizational intricacies and permitting subjective emotions to impinge upon objective professional discernment. Notwithstanding my enduring conviction that an element of inequity characterized Dan's differential treatment of us compared to his male counterparts, retrospective contemplation suggests that perhaps I ought to have merely reconciled myself to the reality that certain individuals favor maintaining exclusively professional rapport. Yet at the juncture, the matter felt so intimately affronting and overtly discriminatory that I found myself unable to simply disregard it. Presently, I am confronted daily with the ramifications of that choice. And candidly, I harbor significant doubt as to whether my professional trajectory will ever wholly rebound from this profound entanglement.